All right, guys, welcome back. So I guess it's Thursday morning when you guys are watching this. I'm doing it Wednesday night. Don't forget the governor's talking tonight, so you guys be sure to watch that about 8 p.m. Okay, so today we're talking about forced migrations. I know the PowerPoint says forced and voluntary, but today we're just going to focus on forced, okay, because both of them together is quite a lot. All right, so if you guys will check out what my pictures are on the beginning slide, I've got an example of forced migration and an example of voluntary migration. Obviously, this one is going to be the forced migration. This is the African diaspora. Yeah, African diaspora. I'm trying to find a place to put myself. Okay. And then, of course, we've got Central Americans that are coming to the border voluntarily out of political issues. Okay, so the standard today says we're going to describe those two types of migrations, but more specifically, we're going to look at slavery, events that produce refugees. So refugees is going to be a very important word for us today. Internally displaced persons, or IDPs, and asylum seekers. Okay, so those are the big ideas we're going to work on today. Okay, so let's establish what forced migration is. Sorry if my bubble's in the way. I'll read to you what it says. What it says is, basically, guys, what this is involuntary movements. Okay, it is not a choice of the individual that's doing this. They are forced, usually by, as you can see up on the screen already, an authority figure. Okay, they must leave. They have no choice. Yeah. Usually, typically, this is going to be a political situation, but in some situations, it becomes environmental. Okay, so like think about like Chernobyl. Nobody could live there after that. Fukushima, they had to move people out, that kind of thing. Okay, no choice. All right, so today we're going to look at slaves. You have to know what slaves are. You have to know what refugees are, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons. All right, trucking right along. So the first one we're looking at today is slavery. If you look at the graphic I've got up there, I got this from the 5.11 website, which you guys really need to check out, especially those of you guys taking the AP test. They have amazing stuff on there. Okay, so what we're looking at is the slave trade, but more importantly, what we're looking at, if you notice the years, is going to be 1650 to 1860, okay? The reason we're looking at this is because, guys, slavery and the African slave trade is the best example of forced migration in all of world history. It's not only the best example, it's also the largest example. We don't have the best records, but anybody that knows anything has got this really good range of about 10 million to 15 million Africans were forcibly removed. And we've talked in class about how the majority of those were going to be people that lived on this area, the west coast of Africa, because of geography. It was literally closer to the burgeoning colonies in the New World where they're going to need forced labor. More on that in just a second. Okay. This is important to us today because the descendants of these people who were forcibly removed from Africa in a forced migration, their descendants live throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. They're all in the Western Hemisphere. Okay. The UN, the United Nations, they still are interested in the number of folks in slavery throughout the world today, and they've estimated that number to be around 21 million. The statistic that I saw as I was reading this was that number is 5 times more than the number of slaves that were in forcible servitude in 1860, which is the year that the Civil War began. Okay, so a lot of people, slavery is still a thing. Okay, so moving on. This is exactly what I mentioned just earlier, the African diaspora. So the African diaspora is going to last from the 15th century. So if you guys remember, back that up 100 years. And so we're talking about the 1400s to the 19th century. In the United States, one of the things you guys need to know in the Constitution, it mentions slavery twice. One of the things that it mentions is that the slave trade will end in 1808. So that's the 19th century. What is a diaspora? Guys, a diaspora is a mass dispersal of people. It's called the African diaspora because African people were dispersed. You'll also hear about the Jewish diaspora, how the Jews were kicked out of the Middle East. Okay, more on that in a little bit too. All right, so the big countries that received the majority of the people that were affected by this diaspora, they ended up in Brazil. Actually, guys, a very large chunk. If you look down here at this picture, we're talking about 5 million of the 10 to 15 million removed from Africa are going to end up in Brazil. If you look in the United States, guys, we're talking, or what will become the United States, we're talking about 500,000. So when you think about all the African Americans we have in our country today, they are descendant from the 500,000 people that were forcibly removed from Africa. 0.3 million ended up in Europe. 4.5 million ended up in the West Indies. And we're going to talk about why these numbers are so much larger than these numbers. Okay. The reason for that is because the low numbers, like what will become the United States. So the American colonies, Europe, what they're going to be doing, guys, is they're going to be farming tobacco, cotton. Okay. So terribly arduous work. Do not recommend it for anybody, especially when you're not being paid. But the worst situation you could possibly find yourself in as a slave is being put on a sugar plantation. And if you notice, Brazil and the West Indies have a very large number of forced migrants from Africa there. It's because of these reasons, guys. Sugar plantations, it's extremely labor intensive. It was hard work. It was backbreaking labor. It had a very, very high crew death rate associated with work on a sugar plantation. Tropical climate. So having to deal with all kinds of funky, nasty germs and diseases that they are totally not used to. So the replacement rate of those slaves is going to be extremely high because they're dying off because of the situation they find themselves in. Okay. Whereas in the British colonies, it'll be other issues that arise. It's not necessarily the climate that comes after them. Although in like Louisiana and other parts in like the Gulf, they did have these sugar plantations. And guys, they were freaking terrible. Ugh. Okay. Moving on. We're moving on now to events that produce refugees. All right, so the first thing we need to discuss is what is a refugee? Oh, I hope you guys can see it and I'm not in the way. All right, so what a refugee is somebody who is living outside of their home country. Okay, so like us would be the United States for most of us, because we're afraid or they're afraid of persecution. So the government coming after them either because of their religion, their ethnicity, their race, politics, etc. So I think one of the examples we keep using in class has been referring back to how the Chinese have the concentration camps with the Muslims. So that would be if Muslims are trying to escape from China, that would be considered refugees. All right. So what is life like for a refugee? Well, guys, they don't have anything with them. It's few provisions because they are being persecuted by their country or authoritarian forces. They have to move quickly. They're also on foot, so they're not getting very far very fast. They have the clothes on their backs. They don't have papers necessarily, like passports and immigration papers and visas, that kind of thing. So, guys, these people are extremely vulnerable. Vulnerable in the fact that they don't have any stability. They don't have a home. They are being forced to move. They're scared. I can't even begin to imagine. Cannot. All right, so one of the first things we need to know about the difference in a refugee and an internally displaced person is going to deal with crossing a border. Okay, so refugees cross international borders. So one of the things we have at the border is we have a lot of refugees that are seeking asylum or political refugees that have come from Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and they have crossed international borders. Okay. Wrong direction. All right. The best example we got going right now is Darfur. I think you guys really studied that pretty hard in 7th grade. As of to date, by the UN, there are 250,000 refugees that have migrated forcibly to Eastern Chad. Okay. They are political refugees trying to get out of the bad situation that's in Sudan. Darfur is in Sudan. Okay. Now, unfortunately, whenever people show up in a country, and they're not people that are typically there, they're not allocated for, don't have necessarily the resources set aside for them, they do end up placing demands on the host country. I think you guys know we talked about how the refugees from the Middle East, from Syria, arrived in Germany and then used the legal system to try to get goods, to try to get a life, to try to get taken care of, because they said they weren't being taken care of. But the German people weren't expecting them. So it gets to be a really difficult situation. I know that this is a conversation that we've had in our country prior to this pandemic that we're experiencing. Another one that I know I've alluded to in class is the African refugees to Europe. More on that later. Okay. All right. So the ones I want to talk to you right now, though, is like Central America. We've talked about this with folks coming from Honduras, coming from Nicaragua, Southwest Asia. So this is like Pakistan. This is, this is Iraq. This is Syria, that area, the Middle East. Israel. Okay. The big thing with Israel was people moved there because of their faith, and they were afraid of being, did I spell Israel right? I'll check that. They were afraid they were being, the Jews are the most hated people in the world. They're always, somebody's always after them. So they moved to Israel for that reason. Okay. Big thing that we need to know going forward in today's world is that the number of climate refugees is increasing with, the changing atmosphere and environment that we have right now. That'll be a bigger number of folks. Think about it. I think I've talked to you guys in class. Go to New Orleans now. It's going to be underwater very soon. Okay, now let's talk about internally displaced person, IDPs. Internally, so inside, displaced, so that means like moved persons. So people moved inside. So guys, what an internally displaced person is somebody who's forced out of their home region, either because of war, politics, environment, that kind of thing, but they don't cross any international borders. So that'd be like, leaving Georgia because of tornado and moving to Kansas. Okay, something like that. You moved. Was there unrest? Yes. Did you cross any borders? State, not international. So you would be an internally displaced person. You were internal. What's very difficult with IDPs is they're undercounted, especially with the census. We don't know where they are. We don't know where they are. They don't have an address. They don't have a census number. Okay? Guys, these folks are really invisible because we don't know where they are. They're still contained. The best example we have in this country as of late that I think you guys would kind of get on board with is Hurricane Katrina. In fact, let's go look at the next slide. This is from the New Orleans local newspaper. And this is from FEMA. And it's all about the number of displaced survivors of Hurricane Katrina and where they sought help from the government, where they filed their claims from. Okay, so the darker it gets, that's the more people that left that area. So if you notice, so here's New Orleans. We had people that went all the way up to Chicago, went all the way up to Detroit, out to Vegas, over to LA. Okay, so this is all an internal displaced people. You guys know Atlanta got a lot of folks. In fact, some of you guys might be here because of that. All right, so moving on. Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. So what are some push-pull factors? Like, why would you go where you're going? Okay, so the push factor is the hurricane. You're out of there. So where would you go? Well, do you have money? How far can you get? Do you have family somewhere? Do you like the temperature? Do they have good jobs there? Good schools? Okay. Let's talk about Ravenstein. Okay, so Mr. Ravenstein, whatever. How are they following his laws? Well, guys, one of the big things he says is that people move a short distance. Boom, boom, boom. That's Houston. That's Mobile. Okay, so that makes sense to me because those are the darkest areas, right? Boom. What about some intervening opportunities? What if you had planned on trying to make it to Chicago, but you stopped in St. Louis and got a really good job, or you met somebody and had a baby? That kind of thing. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about asylum seekers. I did not put any animations on this one. So asylum seekers, guys, are people who are probably the most desperate. They are migrating to another country in hopes of being recognized as being a refugee. So basically they're seeking protection from the first country they arrive in. I guess the best example of someone that's an asylum seeker is Snowden and Julian Assange. They're both asylum seekers. Didn't Ecuador take one of them in or something? I need to watch the movie. All right. So according to the UN numbers in 2017, we have 25.4 million refugees worldwide. We have 40 million people worldwide that are internally displaced persons within their countries. And then we have 3.1 million asylum seekers in the world. So that's a lot of folks. And this is all forced migration. None of these people are choosing. They are being forced out. Nobody chose this. Okay. Something is pushing them out. Okay. Another example I have for you guys is for the asylum seekers is the Palestinian refugees. Okay, so I'm not sure. Let's do a quick lesson right here. Post World War II, the world feels pretty bad for the Jews. So what we do is we establish the state of Israel. Fine, great. However, there's already people living here. Those people that are already living here are Muslim. So what they do is they move them to this area. Boom. Do you see this? That's Palestine. Okay. Well, some of the Palestinians try to get out. Some went to Lebanon. Some went to Jordan. Okay. Now these are refugees. They're not internally displaced because they're crossing international lines. Well, in Jordan, the Palestinians are so ingrained in society that their status is they're permanent refugees. Like, you're here, you're making a business, you're part of the community, you're in, you're good. Whereas if some went to Lebanon, they went north trying to seek asylum, guys, they're still actually in refugee camps and they're still considered to be temporary refugees. Whereas these folks literally, boom, right here, they're Syria, guys. They're not citizens, but they're fully accepted into society. So they're good to go. All right. So the big thing I wanted to end our talk today on is Trail of Tears. How would you categorize it within forced migration? Would you say that Trail of Tears was a refugee situation? Would you say it was internally displaced people? Would you say they are asylum seekers? Okay. So I want you guys to think about it. Give me an answer and I will talk to you soon. Don't forget, we have a quiz on Friday. All right, guys. Bye.